Hello, everybody, and welcome to the AskHistorians Podcast. Today we have a slightly different sort of episode, which will be working as sort of a preview trailer to an experiment we're going to try out on the podcast, AskHistorians Aloud. The purpose of AskHistorians Aloud will be to bring you some of the amazing work that's being done on the subreddit to your ears bi-weekly. These episodes, if the experiment goes as planned, will come out on the opposite weeks to the podcast and will be much shorter 10 to 15 minute long episodes without an intro speech or an outro. This week will be a sort of preview with 4 excellent answers on Ask Historians from a wide variety of topics, all for the price of one episode. I've invited flares and fans to read some of their favorite questions on the subreddit. Please let us know what you think of this experiment, and if you really want to read some of your favorite answers for this podcast, get in touch with me on Reddit or via email at bmwatson1989@gmail.com. Before that, however, as is the first episode of the month, we have our Patreon book drawing. The Patreon helps support and keep this podcast going, and your support is definitely crucial to our mission. To be entered into the book drawing, you can donate $1 a month for 1 entry, $5 for 2, or $10 for 3. Please do come support us on Patreon, because for $1 a month, you can find $1 anywhere probably, you get as a result over 100 hours of deep history content that you won't get anywhere else. And soon we'll be expanding into even more history and even more information. The winner this month will get to pick from 3 books that are cited in the answers I will be reading. The first book is Daughters of Isis, Women of the Ancient World by Joyce Tysoty, which is cited by Cleopatra Philopater. It's about how in ancient Egypt women enjoyed legal and social and sexual independence unrivaled by their Greek or Roman sisters, or in fact by most women until the late 19th century. They could own and train in property, work outside the home, marry foreigners, and live alone without the protection of a male guardian. Some of them even rose to rule in Egypt as female kings. The author's vivid portrayal of how women lived in ancient Egypt weaves a fascinating picture of daily life, marriage and the home, work and play, grooming and religion, viewed from a female perspective in a work that is engaging, original, and constantly surprising. The second choice, our historical fiction choice, is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. It's a classic work of American literature that has not stopped changing minds and lives since it burst upon the literary scene. The Things They Carried is a groundbreaking meditation on war, memory, imagination, and the redemptive power of storytelling. The Things They Carried depicts the men of Alpha Company, Jimmy Cross, Henry Dobbins, Rat Kiley, Mitchell Sanders, Norman Boker, Kiowa, and the character Tim O'Brien, who survived his tour in Vietnam to become a father and a writer at the age of 43. And finally, the third is Eunuchs and Castrati, a cultural history by Peter or Schultz, which is a social history of the role of eunuchs in the household and courts of Greece, Rome, China, Byzantine, medieval Europe, and the East, which aims to challenge traditional preconceptions about eunuch duties. Schultz demonstrates that many eunuchs were not slaves, but were instead important household and government officials who created great influence, notably in the Near East. He also argued that androgyny was idealized as liberated as pure condition in medieval Europe. The lucky winner this month is, drumroll please, Matthew M. Thank you for being a supporter, Matthew. I will contact you via your Patreon email. And the rest of you can find us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Please do rate, review, and help support your historians. Now here's the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
The first answer today will be from Bernardino. It was posted in one of our weekly feature threads, Tuesday Trivia, where people can provide shorter answers based on a trivia theme. The Tuesday Trivia that week was first-person accounts, which asked readers to share any interesting first-person accounts of historical events, both written narratives or recorded oral histories. Bernardino talked about the first use of napalm in Vietnam. He begins, albeit used plenty of times since the end of World War II, and in World War II itself, it is in the Vietnam War in which the use of napalm has captured the popular memory of its use. Whether it's the harrowing image of the new South Vietnamese girl Kim Phuc running away from a village that was just bombed by the VNAF, or by Lieutenant Kilgore's famous line in Apocalypse Now, napalm has become one of the most enduring images and controversies of the Vietnam War. Yet the first time it was used in Vietnam was not by the South Vietnamese, nor the Americans. In 1950, the French Indochina War had turned international. After years of being nothing but a localized conflict of decolonization, it became part of a much larger conflict. The Cold War had properly kicked off, and with support granted to the Viet Minh by the newly created People's Republic of China, the United States in return began to provide material and financial support to France to wage a war that had suddenly turned from being a colonial war to becoming a war against communism. For France, this meant increased firepower, new uniforms, and modern weapons. They got all the benefits. Some fortunate legionnaires at this time even resorted to fighting with World War I vintage level rifles and for lack of modern weaponry. For Viet Minh, however, this meant much more than just weapons. It meant that the borderline ragtag guerrilla army could now start becoming more professionalized and more well-trained. With Chinese assistance, entire divisions were organized, trained, and equipped. And their first equipped test came in September of 1950, when the French-held city of Dong Quai was assaulted and promptly fell. Seeing the situation untenable, the nearby post of Cao Bang was told to lead the outpost and rendezvous with the rescue. Both them and the rescue force coming up the river were constantly ambushed by the Viet Minh on the way there, and when the survivors from these ambushes managed to actually link up, they only managed to enter another ambush, which almost annihilated another 2 columns. Just 600 men returned to French lines after dividing themselves into smaller groups, and around 4,800 men died trying to link up with the other force in the battle, which took place en route Colonial 4. It was a disaster for the French. For the Viet Minh, the time had come to strike up the Red River Delta to open the road to Hanoi and to gain control over North Vietnam. There were few problems in the way of the Viet Minh, though. Not only had the French received a new commander in Jean de La Trétassigny, a man whose military capabilities were extraordinarily competent and who was a veteran of both World War I and World War II, but Vo Nguyen Yap had become a bit too confident after the last successes. Yap thought that the time had come to enter the third conventional stage of Mao's guerrilla theory, and that the Viet Minh were ready to take on the French in an open battle. He was about to make a huge mistake. The first battle in this campaign took place at Vinh Yên. The plan was straightforward: break through the fences and then exploit the gap to move behind the French fences and get onto Hanoi. When the battle began on January 13, 1951, it seemed that Vinh Yên was going to fall and that Hanoi was going to be theirs. They just hadn't counted on de Lattre. Despite sending in reinforcements, he could see in his spotter plane that the situation was becoming very desperate for the French. That's when he scrambled every available aircraft and sent it to bomb the Viet Minh positions around Vinh Yên with napalm to break their attack. A Viet Minh officer by the name of Ngo Vien Chiu witnessed one of these bombardments and later wrote in his diary, quote, "All of a sudden a sound can be heard in the sky and strange birds appear, getting larger and larger. Airplanes. I ordered my men to take cover from the bombs and machine gun bullets, but the plane dive upon us without firing their guns. However, all of a sudden, hell opens in front of my eyes. Hell comes in the form of very large egg-shaped containers dropping from the first plane, followed by other eggs from the second and the third page. Immense sheets of flame, extending over hundreds of meters it seemed, strike terror in the ranks of my soldier. This is napalm, the fire that falls from the skies. Another plane swoops down behind us and again drops a napalm bomb. The bomb falls closely behind us and I feel its fiery breath touching my whole body. The men are now fleeing in all directions and I cannot hold them back. There is no way of holding out under this torrent of fire that flows in all directions and burns everything in this passage. On all sides, flames surround us now. In addition, French artillery and mortars now have our range and transform our position into a fiery tomb what had been 10 minutes ago a quiet part of the forest." Unquote. De Lattre's decision proves to be decisive and the attacks on Vinh Yên is beaten back. While Yap would try twice to break into the Red River Delta, he failed spectacularly and for the rest of 1951 reverts back to guerrilla warfare, having learned his lessons about entering conventional battle without having his army fully prepared. It was a mistake he would never make again, and at Dien Bien Phu 3 years later, he would get his revenge for Vinh Yên. End answer. The second answer today comes from J School Tiger. It was asked by Meeposaurus Rex. The question is, was it common for sailors with physical disabilities like a peg leg to remain employed aboard ships in the age of sail? J School Tiger writes, well, it kind of depends on what you mean by common. Most sailors aboard a ship wouldn't necessarily be missing limbs, but many ships would have maybe one or two sailors with missing limbs. Officers are a different thing, which I'll talk about in a minute. First thing to keep in mind about how enlistment in the Royal Navy worked is that there was no sense of men being permanently enlisted or enlisted for a period of X years. Other than some standing petty officers, the bosun, the carpenter, and the gunner, any men who enlisted for a voyage enlisted for the duration of that voyage and was paid off when the voyage ended. By voyage, I don't necessarily mean there and back again thing, but the length of a unit service of the ship, which could range from a season to several years. It would all be at the discretion of the Admiralty. So sailors who, say, lost a limb in service would usually either be discharged from the ship when it was paid off, or they can be invalidated out in a friendly port. The reason I'm bringing this up is that the system was a bit different than what we have now in a modern Navy, where say you lose a limb but have 3 years of service left. So what would happen if a sailor received a disabling wound while on a ship? In general, they would be treated immediately by the ship's surgeon and or his assistants, assuming the ship was large enough to have one. Amputations were fairly straightforward, though of course carrying the risk of infection was dangerous. Once the sailor could safely be moved, he would generally be treated either at an inn near the port or in the later years at the Naval Hospital in Greenwich, in England. But the assumption was that a disabling wound would set a sailor ashore for a length of time, if not necessarily permanently. Disabled sailors actually were supposed to receive pensions from the Chatham's Chest. The Chatham's Chest was meant to offer a lump sum and annual payment to disabled seamen. It was originally established around 1590, likely by Charles Howard, the first Earl of Nottingham, as well as the Lord High Admiral of England during the Armada, and it was meant to help sailors injured in the Spanish War. The chest functioned as a pension scheme for disabled seamen. Every sailor in the Navy paid into it 6 pence per month, and after 1949, surgeons and chaplains paid 8 pence and 10 pence, and it dispersed annual payments to wounded men based on their injuries. Rates varied over time, but they could be as low as £6 for the loss of limb or up to £15 for the loss of 2 limbs, plus immediate money when the sailor sustained the injury, or realistically when he was injured, lived, and applied for the relief. The chest was quite literally a strong box of money kept at the main naval yard. It was sometimes stupendously mismanaged. For example, we know that Sir Sackville Crowe, Treasurer of the Navy from 1627 to 29, quote, borrowed £3,005 in the chest, which was never repaid even after he was sued for it. But it was meant to function as a relief for the common sailor, and did so with varying degrees of success until 1803, when it was merged into a similar pension scheme at the Greenwich Naval Hospital. Moving towards an actual answer to your question, what sort of disabled men would be eligible to serve at sea? The most common type of limb disability we hear about is sail with a peg leg, popularized no doubt by Treasure Island. And it wasn't uncommon at all for men to be missing a leg or even both lower legs to serve on ship as cooks or in other capacities when they didn't have to go aloft. There was a good deal of work that needed done on a ship that wasn't involved with setting in or taking in sails. For example, every ship had a cook, carpenters, sailmakers, and rope apers, coopers, men who looked after livestock, and other specialized jobs. For a man missing an upper limb, though, most of these avenues would be closed, as much of that work take 2 hands. It's hard to come up with an average. Disability is not very studied in the Navy, but from what I read, I would be comfortable saying that there would be some avenues of work for disabled men. Officers, however, were a different case. They had much more of a chance of being employed if they were missing a limb, either upper or lower. Let's mention Nelson, who lost not only his right arm above the elbow, but also had been blinded in his right eye, ironically, in a land engagement. The main difference between an officer who lost a limb and a common sailor is, of course, that an officer wouldn't necessarily have to work aloft or in a spot requiring both limbs. Furthermore, officers, at least those who were lieutenants or above, were considered to be more or less permanently employed by the Navy, at least once the Navy started offering them half pay for time spent ashore. There certainly were unemployed lieutenants and commanders and even some post-rank captains, but once man reached that high of a rank, promotion depended entirely on seniority. Barring being dismissed from the services for misconduct, once a man was made an officer, he would keep being promoted until he reached admiral rank or died. Question ends. The third answer today is from Castrati, who answered the question, how did early modern era and later Italian eunuchs feel about their inability to father children? Castrati writes, while the vagaries of how castrati could have sex are a mystery to us, it is well established that they did have sex in the period and were considered sexually active and sexually attractive. Perhaps even you can argue that they were seen as sexually aggressive or lustful people in their native Italian culture. However, they were non-reproductive, which is true both then and now. But how much did that matter to their identity as men? Now put on your thinking cap because we are taking a non-negotiable trip to the Gender Studies Department. The following theories on castration and masculinity are from a terribly dense volume entitled The Manly Masquerade, Masculinity, Paternity, and Castration in the Italian Renaissance by Valeria Finucci. Specifically, Chapter 6, The Masquerade of Manhood, The Paradox of the Castrato. The book argues that reproduction mattered intensely to identity as a man in early modern Italian culture. Eunuchs were denied full masculinity as they were non-generative beings, despite being sexual beings. This comes to a head in early Catholic rulings on Spanish eunuchs. In 1586, a Spanish nuncio named Cesar Baccarini wrote to Sixtus V, asking whether eunuchs could marry, as he had already married a few of them, because, as he reported, they could have intercourse. The Pope ruled that they could not marry, and that the marriages should be annulled. Quote, Sixtus did not question the ability of these men to behave like men, that is, to have erections, but for him, manly men were only those able to inseminate and procreate. Thus, he reinforced the view that masculinity was needed to be associated with fertility as a foundational myth of Christian discourse. With Sixtus VI's pronouncement, canon law took the same stance. For instance, a Christian marriage was understood as based on three things. 1. Men's ability to have an erection. 2. To perform intromission. And 3. To produce an emission. In the case of eunuchs or impotents who married, the wife could at any time petition for an annulment of the marriage tie if the husband was unable to perform. But now an apparatus was created to intervene on sexuality before and not after a participating event took place. So the legality of a eunuch's marriage in the 1580s hinged on basically one thing. Were they a man? One person thought yes because they could have sex, but a higher person thought no because they could not reproduce. There is a second part here, where non-reproductive women were not given the same treatment in marriage. Generative ability was seen as solely on the male in Renaissance Italy. The male seed held the entirety of the generative power. The woman's womb was just a receptive vessel that could nurture his seed. So there was a case where a woman's marriage was annulled because she could not be penetrated, but that was only because her womb was not physically available. Had she been sterile but otherwise a receptive vessel, it wouldn't have been her fault. So she was non-reproductive and thus a legal marriage. End quote. Now let's move away from gender theory. Let's talk about what Castrati actually had to say about fatherhood, which is far more interesting. One of our best insights into what Castrati might have thought and felt about themselves is a guy named Filippo Beltrati, who had a pretty interesting life. He went to Russia and sang for the Tsar as a teenager. Then he came back and settled into life as a court musician, working for various European courts. He's also the only castrato known to have written an autobiography, which includes a brief and reasonable description of how he became to be castrated. And notable to our purposes here, his personal expression of regret that he couldn't be a father. Quote, "It was established that my voice was of the finest metal, with a natural trill and good attack, outstanding in fluency, in passage work, and a general taste for natural singing. The basis for this judgment was urgently arrived by my friends and my fathers, crying out, 'Cut! Cut!' and then, more than all the others, by my singing teacher to advise my father, so that after the many cries of 'Cut! Cut!' My father finally joined in too, and sent to Lucca for the surgeon Akrambi, who was made to come to stay at the house for 2 months and engage me in a little gracious conversation. This chitter-chatter was so expensive that instead of the doctoral degree which would have been to obtain one day, I was given a diploma to pass as a cold and injured man for the rest of life, renouncing forever that sweet name that I would have heard given to me one day of Papa." Unquote. This is quite a heartbreaking passage to read. But we should also consider that Baltri was rather alone in the world when he wrote that, as his last close relative was his brother, and he had no children and died before Filippio did. The Italian systems of extended family systems and familial-style networking meant that many castrati were the best sort of doting uncle, and many met their legacies in the hands of adoptive children. Farinelli helped raise his grandniece, Maria Carlotta Pisani, because he arranged for his nephew, Matteo Pisani, and his wife to live with him in Bologna, where she was born. A visitor to an elderly Farinelli reports in a letter that he has this terrible colicky baby at his house that he nevertheless doted on. There seems to have been a lot of love in their relationship. She was only 13 when he died, and he left her a lot of his estate in his will, and most of the Farinelli things that we have in museums and archives are due to her careful attention to legacy and donation of his effects. She also had him reburied in good style after the Napoleonic Wars destroyed his original grave. She was even buried in the grave with him after he died. Castrati also helped raise a grandnephew, and in a letter to Francis Burney expressed his happiness as being able to do so. Caffarelli left his considerable legacy, including an actual dukedom, to a nephew. Gaetano Guidani had a nephew that lived with him when he was older and cared for him after he had a stroke a few years before he died. There's more examples, but it was pretty common for castrati to stay in touch with their family, although not all did, of course. But if we stretch the idea of fatherhood to a more modern interpretation, the emotional lives of castrati are not so sad after all. Answer ends. The final answer today is from Cleopatra Philopater, who was asked by Dino Crocodile, "What would marriage be like in ancient Egypt?" Cleo begins. "So far as we know, there was no specific ceremony or ritual for marriage in dynastic Egypt, which sounds crazy, but it's important to keep in mind that even in the West, the elaborate and iconic wedding, with all the cake, rings, and champagne, is a relatively recent phenomenon. In ancient Egypt, marriage for both the elites and the common people consisted of cohabitation, with no additional legal or religious qualifications. Once a man and woman had moved in together, they could consider themselves to be married, despite not apparently going through any legal process. As a matter of fact, the terminology surrounding marriage is a bit complicated, because there is no term for it. Although the term for wife, hemet, is well attested, sometimes, quote, marriage, unquote, is not described as taking a wife/husband, but simply being with them. This might indicate the lack of a marriage contract or prenuptial agreement, but for the purposes of adultery, there does not seem to have been any difference, and they may very well have been two ways of saying the same thing. The event itself probably would have been marked by some form of celebratory party. Letters from Ptolemaic and Roman periods list details such as the invitation of guests, usually family and close friends, the providing of a dinner, and in a few cases the acquisitions of large amounts of flowers, such as roses or hyacinths, so I guess some things never do change, do they? Processions which accompany the bride to her husband's house are well attested in the Hellenistic and Roman world, and were practiced to some extent by these groups in Egypt. But if similar customs ever developed within Egypt, they left no trace on the historical record. More rarely, men went to live in the house of their wife, but generally it was the woman who entered the house of the man. Marriage contracts are not attested until the late period, and even when they were attested, they by no means were a prerequisite for marriage. Some marriage contracts were even drawn up after the couple had cohabitated for years and had multiple children. Naturally, the Hellenistic and Roman settlers of Egypt brought their own ideas of institutionalized marriage with them. But this does not prevent Egyptian attitudes towards premarital sexuality and the woman's involvement in her marriage from taking root among the immigrant population. Contracts are more frequently attested to by the upper classes, who naturally have engaged in more economically and politically motivated unions. But that said, this meant little more than a carefully negotiated contract and an expensive celebration. You would probably know your spouse fairly well if you were an average person, because they would likely come from your community and know your family in some way. There's some evidence suggesting that parents were involved in the marriages of their children, especially where young daughters are concerned, but it's not clear to what degree those children could choose for themselves. Other marriages are attested where the parent disapproved of the situation, but their child, generally a daughter, ran off with the unsuitable party anyways. The reason for the parental disapproval could be that the other party was deemed to be socially, morally, or even legally unacceptable as a spouse, or it could be for economic purposes if the loss of the daughter who contributed to the household would provide a detrimental impact on the parents. Endogamous marriages, which is to say marrying within a particular social group, was the norm for elites and the royal family in particular. Often they practiced full sibling marriage. However, the marriage of cousins, uncles, and half-siblings was not uncommon throughout all levels of Egyptian society. In the case of death, it was not unusual for spouses to marry close relatives of their deceased significant other. First-time marriages were on average between women in their early to mid-teens and men in their late teens to mid-20s. This is by no means a universal age estimate, and there are plenty of recorded instances of young women marrying men who would have been considerably older, as well as legal restrictions on the inheritance of women who thought to marry while still in their 50s, which indicate that yes, 50-plus-year-old Egyptian women got married, but again, this was a rarity. Given the young age of Egyptian women when they first married, it is likely that they would have had little previous sexual experience, and generally a woman was deemed suitable for marriage when she had her first menses, which marked their departure from childhood, while marriage marked the beginning of adulthood. However, there is plenty of evidence that Egyptian girls, even of those of high status, engaged in premarital and even prepubescent sexual activity, as well as a few instances of girls as young as 8 to 10 marrying. So it is possible that even brides would have acquired some sexual experience by the time of their marriage. Men who may have had previous access to prostitutes and servants, if not lovers of a similar social status, would likely have had more sexual experience than their prospective brides, although Dominic Montserrat has suggested quite appropriately that this is more likely the case for affluent urban men, unlike their poorer, more rural counterparts who simply would not have had as many opportunities for sexual interactions. Given the looser restrictions around Egyptian marriage, it is entirely possible that you and your spouse would have had intercourse multiple times before entering a more stable relationship. The ideal of marriage in Egyptian culture is generally likened to the relationship between a brother and a sister. This is part of why the same affectionate term can be used for brother/husband or sister/wife, with mutual affection being considered a necessity and a worthy goal for men and women. Funerary art, love poetry, and letters from private individuals indicate that friendships and mutually affectionate relationships were expected in marriage, and that they were something that was achieved by many couples. Paintings and statuary also depict couples sharing affection in numerous ways, such as holding hands, sitting together, embracing, or otherwise engaging with each other, while Egyptian wisdom literature encourages men to make their wives happy with gifts and to treat them gently. Women were encouraged to be faithful, supporting, and loving towards their husbands, so that you would expect and be expected to contribute toward building a relationship that ideally would be lifelong and happy. As I said earlier, marrying and having children is evidently one of the life goals that was emphasized in Egyptian wisdom literature, along with social responsibility and prosperity. Having children and a spouse to contribute toward your household's economic output through agricultural labor or textile production and to support you in old age would have been of paramount importance. A marriage and conception would be an integral aspect of your life. Contraceptive aids were known, so limiting the size of your family in that way would have been a possibility depending on your means, but infanticide, especially female infanticide, which was common in Greece and Rome, was not widely practiced in Egypt. Egyptian medical records and magical texts frequently include medicine, charms, and spells to increase sexual potency and pleasure, and the term papyrus depicts a range of sexual positions and acts, although it is not clear whether the text is pornographic, satirical, or instructive, but it indicates an awareness of sexuality in Egyptian records. The act of procreation and sexual intercourse was important in Egyptian culture as it represented rebirth and was wrapped up in the process of reincarnation and the afterlife. Indeed, begetting children was supposed to be one method for entering the afterlife, and Egyptian inscriptions and texts often reference that individuals hope to reunite with their spouses after death and both spend time together and copulate together in the afterlife. On a personal and legal level, there was a surprising emphasis on equality, with each retaining whatever property they acquired before marriage, and any property acquired within marriage being shared jointly between the man and the woman. Custody of children is never clearly defined, but in general, matrilineal descent is emphasized, indicating that regardless of the father, the child was secure in its relationship to the mother's family and its inheritance. Preoccupation with legitimacy that is found in other ancient societies is not in evidence in Egypt, and children not born from a man's wife do not seem to have been valued any lower than children born to him within wedlock. Children born of adultery were excluded from inheriting from their mother's husband and his family, however. Polygamy was often practiced by the aristocracy, so an elite Egyptian man might have multiple wives, but this is not well attested in the lower classes, who seem to have been mostly monogamous. In any case, it was not common, although it is not always clear when written evidence refers to situations where a man has divorced and remarried or is in a polygamous relationship. Polyandry is not attested, however, and married women were monogamous in theory. Of course, not everyone was so fortunate as to marry, and men who neither married or had children still led fulfilling lives otherwise, although less is known about unmarried women besides prostitutes. Couples who did not conceive sometimes adopted children, or even servants, or even their servants' children. Concubines were also sometimes brought in to bear children, and polygamy probably also helped with this. As I mentioned, divorces could be initiated by either party in a marriage for reasons ranging from infidelity, infertility, abuse, or simple incompatibility, and they did not come with any social stigma attached. In the case of a pre-existing marriage contract, both parties would then follow whatever was agreed upon. In some cases, courts and legal officials had to be involved to reach a settlement, and the outcome depended on the reasons for divorce and the nature of the relationship. For instance, in the case of a wife who committed adultery, she would often be sent away with whatever property and income she brought into the marriage and would be frowned upon. But if the husband divorced her for silly reasons due to her inability to conceive, he would often owe her some form of financial reparation and would be the stigmatized party. Following the divorce, ex-spouses sometimes continued to cohabitate with each other because either it was convenient or economic, and this was evidently not a very strange arrangement. All of these aspects of the arguably loose definition of marriage were united by their association to the divine unions of the gods like Geb and Nut or Isis and Osiris, and as a representation of the rebirth and regrowth of the cosmos on a personal scale. Through copulation and procreation, you would ensure and act out your own rebirth after death, and your children, if you had them, would care for you in your old age and continue your family line. Marriage may not have been that institutionalized of a bond, but it was nevertheless a powerful and intimate bond that was protected by law and tradition in Egyptian society. Answer ends. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope we will be able to begin this experiment in the next couple of weeks. In 2 weeks, Andres will be joining us again with a really exciting podcast that I've been waiting for. Please give us some feedback if you like this, love it, or hate this idea. And if you would also like to read some of your favorite Ask Historians answers for this feature, you know where to find me. Thank you, and thank you for enjoying the show.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.